So I'm excited about another session with Scott Foster, who is our resident Japan expert, having been in Japan for over 30 years. And SNS, FiRe, will soon be publishing his book, Stealth Japan. Maybe we can start by asking you what the name means. Stealth Japan, the surprise success of the world's first InfoMerc economy.
Okay, so about 3 years ago, I was having lunch with a senior Japanese bureaucrat under the trees, very nice sidewalk cafe in downtown Tokyo, and he told me in the middle of a conversation about the state of the Japanese economy that he saw no reason whatsoever to let anyone overseas know that Japan was doing just fine, thank you. And that, I suppose, is the reason that I came up with the name Stealth Japan. Of course, the Japanese government has moved on to buy my Abenomics. They're not shy about it anymore. But the point that the bureaucrat was making was that the Japanese economy is actually a success story that has not been adequately recognized, and for many years was not recognized at all. And this is a perception that needs to be corrected. Japan is now the third largest economy in the world. It used to be the second, but it is easily the second most sophisticated economy in the world and accounts for almost 10% of global GNP. So if you don't understand what's going on in Japan, you're missing a big part of what's going on in the world economy.
Yeah, well, for all this talk of the lost decade or decades in Japan, it's interesting to note that real GDP per capita since 1999, Japan's real GDP per capita has actually grown slightly more than that of the United States and the other major industrial economies. I think Australia and New Zealand, which are resource markets for China, have done better, but they're kind of a different case. So, but by that standard, Japan has been, as you said, a stealth success.
Well, it's done relatively well by several measures. Japan has the lowest unemployment rate of the large industrialized economies. Right now it's just a bit under 3.5%. But it has never been much higher than that. And also the reporting of the Japanese economy has focused on gross domestic product, not the Japanese economy as it exists in the world. So the GDP number in Japan has been, on average, 1 or 2% growth for 20 years or so. But the cumulative foreign investment of Japan has gone up 5 times during that period. And Japanese exporters have converted themselves into global manufacturing companies. Automobiles are a prime example. Massive production capacity here in the United States, large and growing capacity in Mexico, and exports from Japan are way, way down. So the business model that started out with government-directed industrial development after World War II and evolved to an export-led growth economy is now a globalized manufacturing economy. And this, I think, I mean, all of you know it because you're aware of Toyota and the other companies, but it has not appeared in a lot of the headlines, and it certainly is not as good a story as saying that Japan is on its last legs.
Well, and as you note, U.S. companies don't compete with Japanese GDP; they compete with Japanese companies, and they're doing great.
Well, they're doing very well now because the quantitative easing or money printing by the Bank of Japan has taken the exchange rate from 80 to the dollar to 120 in the past 3 years. So corporate profits are up. Export competitiveness, particularly against the Koreans, is way up. Most of the economic metrics are up.
Well, yeah, there's what the Chinese currency weakens by 5% or whatever, and everybody freaks out. But there's been this big weakening of the Japanese currency, and it's been pretty much under the radar.
Yeah, well, not a peep out of the American government, which is a big change from what happened in the past. But the Japanese policy has also changed. There is an evolutionary sequence of economic development that's followed by Britain first and then the United States. You build your economy behind protectionist barriers. As soon as you're strong enough, you become a devotee of free trade and then become even bigger as your once protected industries take market share worldwide. Japan is just reaching that stage. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, the TPP agreement, just a couple days ago, the governments negotiating that agreement reached well, something close enough to a final agreement that is going to be taken to the Congress in the United States and legislative bodies around the world. The Japanese have been a major advocate of getting the TPP done. And that reflects their national interest, which is now supportive of a legal, stable, predictable international trade regime and protection of intellectual property.
Well, and in fact, that's an important point because it really is a shift in where Japan is now supporting intellectual property protection and protection of overseas investments and of at least managed trade, which is puts them much more now on our side of the trade equation.
Yeah, they've come over to our side. I mean, that's probably the major development in the Japanese economy in terms of its relationship with the world economy that's taken place in quite a long time. I mean, all of you are familiar with the old trade arguments against Japan, going back to the Japan Inc. formulation of what they were doing, and the arguments made by the U.S. auto industry. But that is increasingly irrelevant. They don't even have a national policy to deal with Silicon Valley or the kind of thing that we've been hearing about at this conference. Apple has 47 or 48% of the cell phone market in Japan. Android has most of the rest, and there's no policy to deal with that. I think it's because the bureaucrats in Japan don't understand it. But Micron Technology bought Japan's last maker of DRAM memory chips, and that was not stopped. So the whole attitude toward international trade and investment has greatly changed. And on their own part, the Japanese have been on a major international M&A binge, and they have been buying hundreds of companies overseas. And the big ones you no doubt know about, Sprint. Suntory bought Beam, and a company called
What? Beam is a Japanese company?
Yeah, Beam's a Japanese company, so a Japanese-owned company, and a company called Lixil had bought American Standard. But there are many, many more, and most of these don't make headlines. But what they do is they add products, technology, and market access, marketing networks to Japan's international economy.
Well, and that also gets back to the measure of GDP as the measure of success, which the distinction between GDP and GNP, the major difference there being income from investments overseas, where Japan is doing quite well.
Yeah, income from investments overseas, but also the production and the sales and the profits of those overseas businesses are not counted. I mean, GDP is what it says, gross domestic product. And
But it doesn't
In
take
Japan,
into account the investment flow,
right, and, yeah,
the
and
income from investments.
If most of your new investment is overseas, it's not going to be captured in GDP. And that has led to a lot of easy but misleading headlines about what's really going on in the Japanese economy. And one other thing that you mentioned that I want to pick up on is that, you know, American companies don't compete with Japanese GDP. They compete with Japanese companies. And there's been a lot of concern about the demographic decline in Japan, shrinking workforce. But Japanese companies, good Japanese companies, have access to the global workforce. It's essentially unlimited. And the percentage of their business done overseas and the percentage of their employees who are foreign is going up and up and up. So we have a mismatch here with the description of the economy and then the actual fact of what you're dealing with if you're competing with a Japanese company like Toyota, for example.
Well, and that's why when you look at the absolute GDP measure, their growth looks modest, but when you look at GDP per capita, with their population being essentially flat now, working age population going down, from the standpoint of the Japanese people, they're actually doing pretty well. And as you noted, with low unemployment, still persistently low or non-existent inflation, which kind of gets us to the last time we got together. It was May of 2014 at the last FiRe, and our discussion then focused on what was known as Abenomics, and the three arrows of Abenomics, and it might be helpful to refresh people's memories as to what those three arrows are.
Okay, so monetary easing, quantitative easing in the phrase of economists, money printing is another way to look at it. In other words, a big expansion of the money supply to drive down what was, from the point of view of Japanese manufacturers, a grossly overvalued exchange rate. That's easy to do, and Mr. Kuroda, the head of the Bank of Japan, has been very effective in using that as a policy tool. Then more public works spending, fiscal stimulus. They've done that. The focus has shifted from building excessive amounts of infrastructure, airports they really don't need, and more roads that they might not need, to maintaining the infrastructure. And of course, after the big earthquake, they had a lot more to maintain. So they've been able to do that without wasting money. And they have, of relevance, to an American audience, they have maintained and improved their infrastructure since the financial crisis triggered by Lehman Brothers. The third arrow is economic structural reform. And the best example of that right now is the TPP trade agreement, which gives the Abe government a hammer with which to beat the agricultural lobby in Japan, which is lagging behind economic development of the country as a whole, and starting to be a real problem because it's not flexible, it's raised prices to uncompetitive levels, it's prevented diversification of the agricultural sector, and it's all run by nationwide cooperatives. And again, in any country, dealing with the agricultural lobby is not easy, and the Japanese government has wanted to use the trade agreement to help them break down the lobby in Japan, and fortunately it looks like it's going forward.
Prime Minister Abe has had the advantage of very strong majorities in the Diet. Now, but historically, the LDP was sort of known as the party of the farmers and the agricultural lobbies, right? Is that still the case?
I think they still get majority support from rural areas. Mm-hmm. In the last two elections, so December 2014, December 2012, the LDP and their coalition partner, Komeito, got two-thirds majorities. And that's not possible without having support from rural areas.
But there are structural changes in the works other than just agricultural policy, right?
Yes, they have any number of policies. There's like 40 or 50 of them. But the things that really matter are getting the regional economies growing Tokyo's doing very, very well. The best analogy is the UK, where London is doing very well, but other regions of the UK have not done very well. And Japan is similar to that. So they have to solve that problem, because if they don't solve that problem, they won't be able to solve the demographic problem, and the growth will eventually fizzle out. So what's happening now with the yen having come down so much, they're building new shipyards. This was a big surprise to me. Japan has retaken the lead in international shipbuilding from Korea and China. But they haven't done it with bulk carriers. They've done it with LNG carriers. So they're very sophisticated vessels, and of course tie right into imports of LNG and Japan's international energy policy.
So with the three arrows being monetary stimulus, fiscal stimulus, and structural change, the fiscal stimulus ties in with the monetary stimulus because Japan's government has a very high level of debt, much higher than any other major industrial country.
Yeah, so it's over 200%. Government debt as a percentage of GDP. The interest coverage is a problem, but much less of a problem. The 10-year government bond is at 0.335%, I think, as of this morning.
Pretty easy to finance the debt at that interest rate.
Yes, and also the Bank of Japan has been, buying back a large percentage of the new bond issues. So it owns close to 30% of Japanese government bonds outstanding. So you have a huge government debt, and that makes another great headline. But if 30% of it is owned by the Japanese government, well, the actual debt is a lot lower than it looks.
Well, moreover, I think over 90% of the debt is owned by Japanese themselves. So to some extent, they owe the money to themselves. But you make the point that roughly 30% is owned by the Bank of Japan, and that's going up maybe toward 50%?
Give them time, and I expect that Mr. Kuroda is heading in that direction if he can do that.
And the only disadvantage of that is so-called debasing the currency, which in Japan's case is a good thing, devaluing the currency, and inflation, which Kuroda is still struggling to generate some positive inflation. Is that right?
Well, of the advanced industrial countries, Japan is the top beneficiary of lower oil prices, importing almost all of its energy.
Especially after Fukushima and shutting down 50 nuclear plants.
Yeah, and also other resource prices have gone down, and that all helps curtail inflation in Japan. And actually, the Japanese government has come out recently, and Mr. Kuroda also, saying that a 2% inflation target is not perhaps a realistic target anymore, because the general economic situation has changed so much. And that's on the positive side. It's the energy and resource prices. On the negative side, the Japanese depend on overseas markets, and aside from the U.S., none of them are really very good anymore. China's slowing down. All the BRICS countries have slowed down or gone into recession. Europe does what it does. So I think that actually structural reform is now more important than it was before. Well,
and in fact, Japan has had a pretty extraordinary success given the hits that their economy has taken with the tsunami, the Fukushima, the shutdown of their 50 nuclear plants. They were hit very hard by the global financial crisis, and yet GDP per capita, they've done slightly better than most of the rest of the industrial world since '99. So it looks like the preliminary verdict on Abenomics so far is a success.
Well, I think so, but aside from trying to win a debate over economics, it's, I think, very important for American companies and companies around the world to view Japan as an opportunity. Certainly Apple and Oracle and Salesforce view Japan as a major opportunity, because they have effectively no Japanese competition at all, and no resistance from the Japanese government. Instead of looking at Japan as a protectionist monster that blocks our car sales, we should look at Japan as a major opportunity for high tech. And that also plays into Japan's comparative advantage, which is not in what Silicon Valley does. It's in enabling what Silicon Valley does, like the high-precision components in the iPhone, for example. Most of the most sophisticated parts are made in Japan, but Japan could never come up with the iPhone. So the fit is pretty good.
We're actually down to less than 5 minutes to go. So if anybody has any questions for Scott, go to one of the microphones here. There's one here and one over here. As you know, Japan has been a big beneficiary of plunging oil prices, and in fact, that has been referred to as the fourth arrow.
Yeah, so given how much that Abe has pushed on the TPP, and given that there's a clear split in the Democratic Party now between Obama and Hillary on supporting it, how do you read the coming U.S. debate on this from a Japanese, because they're going to be pushing very strongly to get it adopted. But
well, yes, that's exactly right. And if the U.S. Congress sinks the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, it will be a setback for the Abe administration, a setback for Japanese economic modernization, and it will cause major damage to the credibility of the U.S. government. In the next month or so, there's going to be a summit in Seoul between the presidents, prime ministers of Japan, South Korea, and China. And one of the things on the agenda is the Japan-Korea-China trade agreement. So if the Congress fails to pass the TPP, you might wake up, very shortly thereafter with a trade agreement between Japan and China.
Next question.
You mentioned the quantitative easing and your sense that the debt wasn't actually as big as it might seem looking at it from the distance. But what's your sense of where that goes? There's been a lot of quantitative easing around the world. Is that just kicking the can down the road?
Yeah, so Abe and Kuroda have said, and I think it's correct to say, that the top priority is growth. If you don't have economic growth, then paying down debt is just a road to recession, as we've seen in Europe. They do have goals to cut government debt as a percentage of the economy and a percentage of the budget. They tried to raise the sales tax, the consumption tax, to help pay down that debt. They had to do that because if they hadn't tried to raise the tax, they would have been seen as profligates, just spending their way to the country's oblivion. But it was a stress test of the Japanese economy, and the economy failed the test. So they backed off, and they have delayed and reduced the planned increases in the sales tax. It's still there, but the growth and the tax revenues have to come first. Tax revenues are way up because corporate profits are way up. So that's positive. I don't think Japan has the kind of international debt problem that countries that are dependent on outside sources of funding have. But this could be a serious internal accounting problem. And they're trying to come to grips with it, but it's a very slow process.
I would just add that debt is a problem when you don't, when it's not owed in your own currency. When you owe the debt in your own currency and the debt is owned by those in your country, there's no risk of a debt crisis because you can always monetize it. Well, the problem with monetizing debt potentially is inflation. In the case of Japan, they've been struggling for 20 years to generate some positive inflation. So to the extent that they can continue to monetize the debt without any negative consequences, it's not a problem. It seems that Kuroda will continue to monetize the debt, in which case you're in effect canceling out the debt.
I think that's basically right. So if we want to worry about something, we can worry about oil prices going back up.
Yeah, that's
it's
the
happening
big
now.
issue for Japan. I mean, again, and the other issue with debt is interest coverage. If you're paying interest at 0.3%, that's not an issue. But oil prices are the issue, and as you've noted, right now Japan is really probably the world's major beneficiary of low oil prices, which is, if nothing else, has saved Abenomics.
Yeah, I think that.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Scott and I could talk for another hour, but we have to relinquish the stage.
Cool.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you very much.